Bonjour, je m'appelle Rachel Fallman. Je suis membre du collectif pour un choix éclairé dans Nicolet-Yamaska. Aujourd'hui, on vous présente une capsule d'information concernant le bruit des éoliennes avec notre invitée, Dre Mariana Alves-Pereira. Elle est professeure associée à l'université Lusofona à Lisbonne, au Portugal. Dre Pereira a un baccalauréat en physique et une maîtrise en génie biomédical. Elle a obtenu son doctorat en sciences environnementales. Elle nous parlera aujourd'hui d'infrasons, des bruits de basse fréquence ainsi que la maladie vibroacoustique. Nos échanges se dérouleront en anglais, mais vous pouvez suivre la conversation avec les sous-titres. Bonne écoute. So, hello, Dr. Alves-Pereira. Thank you for taking the time to talk to us today.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
So let's jump right into it. Can you explain to us what vibroacoustic disease is?
Yes, it's a pathology that is developed when you are exposed for a very long time to infrasound and low frequency noise. It is mostly seen, or it has been seen for a very long time among occupational exposures, so workers in the industry, but ever more now we're seeing environmental vibroacoustic disease.
And what causes some people to be affected by vibroacoustic disease more than others?
Well, it has to do with accumulation of exposures, right? So it's just like radiation, right? If you have one X-ray per year, that's okay, right? Nothing's going to happen to you. But if you have one X-ray every day for like 2 years, you accumulate exposures. And that's why after 2 years, you know, that person will have more susceptibility to developing a certain diseases time caused by radiation than others. So with infrasound and low frequency noise, it's the same thing. You cannot compare a person who has not been very much exposed to, say, a pilot, right, who has had enormous exposures. So that's why you have different developments and different onsets of vibroacoustic disease, even though you have the same exposure.
And so when we're talking about vibroacoustic disease, this is something that can happen when you're exposed to these types of sounds from wind turbines. So does the size of wind turbine play a role in terms of its vibroacoustic impact on the environment?
Yes. The larger the blade, the more air is moved, hence the higher the pressure wave that is emitted from the wind turbine. In fact, we have cases where people have lived near small wind turbines for years, and they have not had a problem. Small meaning very small, 70 meters high, small wind turbines. Nowadays, of course, they're going up to 200 meters and the blades are getting larger. So yes, the infrasonic output will depend on blade size. And so the larger the blade, the more the infrasonic output.
Okay. Because infrasonic output is not a word that we hear very often when we're reading these articles, when we're talking to the companies that are selling these wind turbines. So do you have any idea why this isn't something that we hear often, these terms, this type of...
Well, there's the historical reason. And the historical reason is when we were developing the telephone back in the 1920s, the only thing that mattered was the part that we could hear, right? Ultrasound, which we cannot hear, and infrasound, which we cannot hear, didn't matter to the telephone, right? As we move along into the 40s and 50s, we start worrying about sound to protect the workers' hearing. Again, we don't hear in infrasound, we don't hear in ultrasound, so infrasound and ultrasound were cut out of the protection of humans because it doesn't affect our hearing. As we gallop on into the 80s and the 90s, there's ever more infrastructure and ever more industrialization, and it became convenient to continue with this idea that acoustic outputs, so noise that we don't hear, like the X-rays for visual, but it's infrasound for the acoustics. It became very convenient that we just ignore this part of the acoustic spectrum, even though it is detrimental. I should add that when I say we, I generally mean the West, because there are countries that do have legislation specifically against infrasound exposure, both in occupational and environmental settings. So there are countries that have this. We in the West, however, do not.
Okay, and could you give us a few examples of countries that do have this type of legislation?
Well, the Russian Federation has this type of legislation since the 80s. In the 1970s, in France, 1973, they organized the French National Research Council, organized a huge symposium dedicated to infrasound. And at the time, there were Soviet scientists, there were European scientists, and also American continents, so Canadians and American scientists. And the results of that for the Russian Federation scientists was to establish legislation and permissible exposure levels for infrasonic ranges. The response of the West on the heels of that was, if you can't hear it, it won't hurt you. And so they continued with the historical line of, we only focus on what can hurt the hearing and nothing else.
Okay, thank you. So we often hear that there aren't any adverse health effects related to wind turbines, or that people suffering from health problems are making it all up. But even the World Health Organization recognizes that infrasound and low frequency noises are an environmental problem and can have adverse health effects. Can you comment on this?
Well, let's take the people out of this and let's just look at the animals, right? So if the animals are also getting sick, that eliminates all this shenanigan about psychosomatic problems and nocebo problems, and they're just inventing it because they want the money, right? The human factor stuff. So yes, infrasound exposure causes health effects. It depends on how long you're exposed, and it depends on a whole bunch of factors. You can see that in the animals. Again, look, this is, I know we're here for the wind turbines, but you see, recognizing infrasound as the agent of disease that it is means that all the people exposed to occupational infrasound will now go and sue their employers, right? So, and let's not talk about the military, because the military is a huge sector where they have enormous amounts of people exposed to infrasound and low frequency noise. Back in the 80s in the US, it was a big thing when it was recognized that occupational hearing loss could occur within the military. So there was a lot of payments made to military personnel, and that's just the military, right? Let's, tanks, submarines, weapon systems, all of these things have an enormous infrasonic acoustic output. There are many other professions, miners, pilots, truckers, all these people are exposed to infrasound on an occupational setting. So if we open the floodgates for wind turbines and say, oh, infrasound is really bad for your health, so we shouldn't put wind turbines so close to the homes anyway, everybody else will come and say, well, I'm exposed to infrasound as well, and me too, gimme money, right? I mean, that's the thing. Again, as to the question of whether or not there are health effects, again, let's look at the animals, right? The sheep, I mean, there's numerous papers now out. The most recent I saw were rabbits in Spain. A whole rabbit farm had to close down in Spain because of the wind turbines. But we have, the mink in Denmark. We have chickens in Canada. I mean, there's animals all over the place getting really sick. The sheep and the cows in France. Yeah, that doesn't hold any water, that there's no adverse health effects. But even if you still insist, then we should look at the Russian and Chinese scientific output, where they are studying in laboratory settings, they are studying the effects of infrasound exposure on animals. Totally scientific. I mean, we're talking about channels and cellular channels and things like this. So yeah, it really doesn't hold any water that infrasound has no adverse health effects.
Okay, thank you. And so if we're talking about infrasound and ways to measure this type of noise, what are some of the problems that we can encounter when we're trying to measure infrasound and low frequency noise?
Well, again, there's a historical reason for this. This is not like some conspiracy theory. Initially, we wanted to measure the noise that was causing hearing loss, right? So we focused, the acoustic spectrum is like the light spectrum, right? We see in a small area, and then all the other stuff we don't see, right? So it's the same thing in the acoustics, right? So we hear in a small region, but everything else we don't hear. So when we're thinking about protecting the hearing of people, of workers, of course, we're only going to focus on sound, right? So the acoustics that we can hear, that's what we're going to focus on. Unfortunately, that has spilled over into the environmental sector. And so when we do noise analysis, we do it in the old methodology, which is what is legislated, and we only look at the part where it's going to hurt our hearing. If it is permitted, I have a couple of slides that might be interesting for everyone to see, because it fully explains what I'm talking about. As you can imagine, measuring noise is a highly technical endeavor, and to explain all these details to your viewers, it may be complicated, but with pictures, everything becomes much easier. So I am just going to pull up the PowerPoint, and I'm going to share this relevant screen right here. And just give me a moment, please. I'll make this big. And now I can go and share the screen. I think this will be much more useful than my words. Do you see?
Yep.
Okay. So you see these little red bars on the right?
Mm-hmm.
That is what legislation tells you to measure. It is what is commonly known as the dBA. Mm-hmm. And as you can see, in fact, we don't hear below 20. So this is actually quite good to protect the hearing. It focuses on the sound that is above 20 hertz. 20 and below is the infrasonic range. So these little red bars, which is what legislation tells you to measure, is what they base their decisions on. But the pink bars, it was actually there. It's the acoustic energy that is actually there. And yet, all you're measuring, all that you're demanded to measure by legislation all over the world almost, are these little red bars. Well, as you can imagine, this is quite insufficient, because all of the infrasonic output of wind turbines occurs where the pink bars are. So in the infrasonic range, which is literally truncated from analysis for the reason that what you can't hear won't hurt you. And the objective was always to protect the hearing. So I think this might be, a better, I'm going to stop the share. I think people can now understand how if we measure noise by what is imposed upon us through legislation, we will never measure the acoustic output, the real acoustic output of wind turbines.
Okay. And I'm going to assume here, but you can correct me if I'm wrong, but the wind turbines, well, they have an acoustic output, but so does everything else in
That's
the
right.
environment. So is it a cumulative effect that or how does it work?
Well, the peculiarity of wind turbine acoustic output is that it's a pulsed pressure wave. Okay, if you live near an airport, you're going to have infrasonic output, but usually it'll be a steady tone. Even in the infrasonic range, it'll be a steady tone. Okay, if you live near a big supermarket, you know, it'll be a steady tone. With the wind turbines, not only is the output very high compared to background noise, because usually where are these things? They're in rural areas. So the background noise is usually very low. So what comes out over background noise is a pulsed wave, pressure wave. It's pulsed. Not even, to my knowledge, not even the Chinese or the Russians study pulsed infrasound in the laboratory. So because we don't usually get pulsed infrasound, right? This is one of the peculiarities of wind turbines, the infrasonic acoustic output of wind turbines, that it's pulsed.
Thank you. And so you mentioned earlier that the wind turbines can have an effect on certain animals. Generally speaking, the effect on biodiversity, has that been studied? What are the effects?
Well, that's not my area specifically, but from what I know, there are several studies regarding the birds. It's a tragedy for the birds. I understand that the insect population is also affected. I have personal knowledge of a case in Portugal where the ants from the house disappeared, completely disappeared. Ants all over the place before, no ants after. Badgers in England have been studied, and their cortisol levels are increased with the stress. Mink farms in Denmark have closed down. Again, there's that rabbit farm that closed down in Spain. It comes, you know, after a while, you have to just close down because all your animals are dying. Now, is there anybody studying this properly? Because if you're going to study this and measure the noise with those little red bars, then you won't find anything, right? So yes, I think it does have an effect on biodiversity, but that's not my field of expertise. And so, but other studies are out there attesting to that fact.
And in terms of the distance, does the infrasound work? Does it work in such a way that the farther away you are from that pulsation or from the infrasound or low frequency noise, does that have an impact on the effect it could have on humans or animals?
Well, distance is certainly a factor, but it's not a clear-cut linear thing, because if your distance is across a prairie, or if your distance is through a mountain range, then the acoustic propagation will vary. Okay, so it's not just distance, but distance is a huge factor. Now, I personally, particularly now with these big wind turbines, the larger ones, I wouldn't live 50 kilometers close to them. I mean, that would be, if I had to live anywhere close to them, that would be my limit. You see, because the propagation of infrasound, physically, the way it happens is it stretches over a much larger extent of space than does little stuff that we hear. I'll give you a live example that I think everybody has experienced. And imagine you're in the city, and in the next block over, there's a car with one of those boom systems, you know, the music boom systems. What do you hear a block away? It's not the voice. It's not the words of the song. You hear the thump, 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 thump. That's low frequency. That's what travels. It's not the little waves, which are the ones that we hear, which are in centimeters in terms of length. They're very small, so they don't get to travel all the way across the block. But the lower frequencies, they have a large length and they can travel many, many kilometers. So a personal experience, which I think everybody has had, is one of these cars that drives by. You hear the thump, which is bass, right? The bass. But you don't hear the higher frequencies. And so that shows you how much low frequency travels more than higher frequencies. And when we're talking about wind turbines, we're talking about infrasound and low frequencies. So it can travel kilometers and kilometers.
Yeah, because 50 kilometers, that's a huge distance, because in our case, we're talking about 800 meters in some case from home. So people were a bit concerned about that distance, and all we hear about is the sound that we can hear. But it's been interesting to hear from you about the range that we should in fact be looking at when we're calculating maybe the distance, or even just really what's going on with all the sound that's being output from these machines. So in terms of your experience, because you've been looking at this for many, many years, is there anything, closing remarks that you'd like to make for anyone who's listening to this or watching this video?
Look, protect yourselves, protect yourselves. If you are young and you're planning on having a family, do not live in a home near wind turbines. It affects the reproductive system. We know this since the 60s. So just protect yourselves. Whether you should fight or not, that has to be up to you. If you do want to fight for a home which is in the proximity of wind turbines, I suggest that you find an alternative place to sleep, because soon your health will be at such a state that you won't be able to fight. So it's very serious, the health effects that some of these people are feeling, and it really impedes them from taking a stronger stand of, in our society, my house is my castle. You defend your house until the last minute, some options for people who just cannot run away from their homes, either because their business is there, they have animals, there's a whole bunch of reasons, financial reasons as well. Think about buying a recreational vehicle, because when the wind turbines are close to the homes, the problem is the sleep time. The problem is that you are sleeping within an environment which is aggressive to your cells. So one of the options that many people around the world have taken, and they feel it's better, they buy a camper, and on the bad nights, everybody goes. I mean, they all go into the camper and they drive away to a place where they can sleep. So this is a way of protecting your health if you do in fact have to live near wind turbines. This is an example. Okay. So protect yourselves. Sorry.
No, thank you. And just to clarify again, not everyone is impacted by infrasounds in the same way. Is that correct? Like, some might feel the impacts and might have sleep problems, but others might not.
It's a question of time.
Okay.
It's a question of time, as I said, the ones who do not probably do not have extensive prior exposure to infrasound and low frequency noise. Those who feel it right off the bat most likely have extensive prior exposure to infrasound and low frequency noise. And you see, one of the more expensive but required aspects when one wants to do a proper scientific study of this stuff is you have to give each individual human an interview to assess what is their prior exposure. When I give these interviews, my first question is, where was your mother pregnant with you? Yes, fetal exposure is where it begins. So, you know, who are we comparing? Some people get it, some people don't. Who are we comparing? You see, so this is what science, old school science would never allow this sort of shenanigans to go on. This is a physical agent of disease. You must tally the prior exposures of people. So to say, oh, well, this one gets it and that one does it, and therefore, you know, it's only in that person's head, is just, and in fact, you know, it's this, the way we measure sound also promotes this, right? Because since you're only measuring those little red bars on the right, you don't know what the heck is happening here. So you can have two entirely different environments, one massively contaminated with wind turbines and the other not, and the legislated value of noise will be the same. So you see, so this is all scientifically very bad.
No, thank you for clarifying. And one last question. When you're talking about infrasound and low frequency noise being an agent of disease, what are some of the symptoms or effects of this disease? We talked about sleep deprivation, but are there other symptoms?
Yes. Well, I'm just going to talk about the wind turbine contaminated homes, because the onset of symptoms depends on whether you're occupationally exposed or environmentally exposed, right? The problem with the wind turbine environmentally exposed is that they have no respite. So occupational exposures go home at the end of the day. So their exposure, presumably if they're not living in a wind turbine home, their exposure stops when, you know, at the end of the workday. So during the rest of the day and the next morning, their body can recuperate. There is no such thing in homes that are environmentally contaminated. So besides not sleeping, people start feeling, specifically in the wind turbine homes, they can start feeling pressure on the ear, not in, on the ear. They can start feeling pressure on the chest. Soon, digestive and intestinal problems may emerge. People who are prone to autoimmune problems will have them greatly exacerbated, because one of the things that infrasound does, exposure, it compromises your immune system. So headaches is another thing. Blurred vision. It really, it's going to depend on how old you are, because your age is obviously going to reflect a little bit of your prior exposure. But those are the main things. Of course, psychologically, then you can't concentrate. It takes you like a day to get through one email after a while. It's you can be continuously nauseated for no reason. You don't throw up, but you just continuously nauseated. There are things like this. Of course, as you continue to remain in this home, more and more problems will occur. But those are the initial ones. And I should add that most people, they don't even realize that it's the wind turbines or whatever in the environment. They only realize this when they go on vacation. They remove themselves from this. So what they thought was menopause, what they thought was old age, what they thought was, oh, was the hangover, or, you know, no, you know, it's not, because when you go on vacation, it all disappears. So, yeah.
Good. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to clarify a lot of this information for us. Really appreciate it. Donc, en terminant, si vous avez d'autres questions à poser à Dr. Pereira Alves, je vous invite à contacter le collectif pour un choix éclairé dans Nicolet-Yamaska ou écrire vos commentaires en dessous de la vidéo. Donc, merci beaucoup d'avoir été à l'écoute.
Thank you.